booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Our topic today is Moloka'i by Alan Brennert. Our guest is Rosemarie, whom I met through Chief and the DC Chief Book Club. Rosemarie, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Well, thank you, Naomi, for inviting me today to talk about this wonderful book, Moloka'i. My day job is actually scaling technology companies. So when I need a break from doing some of that work, I look for interesting books to read and interesting people to know. So that's how we connected. And I'm excited to explore a book that I didn't even realize would have popped up on your list of booked and banned.
That is so true. I didn't know it was going to be on here either. But let's put the book in context. Beginning in the late 19th century, Hawaii, Moloka'i follows the life of Rachel Kalama, a spirited 7-year-old girl whose life is upended when a small rose-colored mark appears on her skin, discovered by her mother. Diagnosed with leprosy, now more familiarly known as Hansen's disease, Rachel is forcibly separated from her family and exiled to the isolated settlement of Kalaupapa on the island of Moloka'i, a leper colony. The novel highlights a devastating historical reality. Native Hawaiians were especially vulnerable to leprosy, as they had no natural immunity to the diseases introduced by foreign sailors, traders, and missionaries. During this era, the illness was not just a medical crisis, but a tool of social displacement, disproportionately ravaging the indigenous population and tearing apart the fabric of Hawaiian families. The novel spans decades, transforming from a story of tragic loss into a breathtaking epic of resilience. Rachel navigates a world where the, quote, living dead, unquote, create their own vibrant community, finding family among her fellow patients, experiencing forbidden love, and witnessing the dramatic shift of Hawaii from a kingdom to a U.S. territory. It is a deeply researched testament to the human spirit's ability to flourish even under the shadow of a state-mandated isolation. While Moloka'i is a beloved international bestseller, often praised for its historical accuracy and empathy, it has faced challenges in specific educational and library settings. So we're going to go through why it has been targeted. First, sexual content. The book portrays the reality of life in the settlement, including romantic and sexual relationships between patients. Some censors have labeled these passages as explicit or inappropriate for young readers. Themes of medical trauma, the graphic descriptions of the progression of Hansen's disease, and the sometimes brutal medical treatments before a cure was found have been cited as, quote, too distressing, unquote, for certain age groups. The portrayal of the Catholic Church. The novel provides a nuanced, often critical look at the Catholic Church's dominant presence in the settlement. While the story acknowledges individuals who offered genuine care, it primarily highlights how missionary efforts frequently prioritize dogma over the actual well-being of the patients. Brennert illustrates how the Church's arrival brought a rigid moralism that was at odds with Hawaiian culture and attempted to erase it. Rather than simply offering comfort, the missions frequently pathologize the patient's cultural traditions and personal relationships. By imposing strict Western notions of sin and shame upon a population already suffering from state-mandated exile, the institutional church added a layer of psychological and spiritual burden to their physical ailments. This critique of religious overreach and the erasure of indigenous Hawaiian spirituality is a frequent catalyst for the book's inclusion in, quote, sensitive materials, unquote, debates. So the context of the ban is that most bans regarding Moloka'i aren't nationwide prohibitions, but rather curriculum challenges. In several instances, parents or school board members have petitioned to have the book removed from required reading lists or moved to restricted sections of high school libraries. Critics often argue that the book's mature themes require a level of emotional maturity they feel students lack, while defenders point to the book's profound ability to teach empathy and Hawaiian history. Rosemarie, Moloka'i is not well known outside of Hawaii, but tells such a story about Hawaiian culture and Hansen's disease. You and I read the book for our book club at your urging, and in some ways, the novel strikes me as a love letter to Hawaii. Why did you choose this book for the book club for today's episode, and what about it resonates for you?
Well, as you know, I have had a lot of, I'll say, synchronicity with this novel. I've lived in Hawaii myself, on Oahu principally, and I visited Moloka'i myself. I did not get to Kalaupapa. However, I did spend time on the island of Moloka'i and had begun to learn about the challenges that not just the exiled patients experience there, but also the challenges of living off the grid, which a lot of the folks on Moloka'i still do to this day by choice. Hawaii is a very rich, diverse, cultural, environmental, and ecological space. And it is poorly described in mainland history books. I certainly did learn a lot about it, and I felt I got a very good education in my upbringing. But it wasn't until I lived in Hawaii that I got a real sense of the history, not just of Moloka'i, but also of the state and the people and the territory before it was a state and the kingdom, and the rich generations that stretched back behind that. All of which informed what happened to Moloka'i, the island, Kalaupapa, the settlement, and all the patients who originally were exiled there starting in the 1860s under the monarchy, and then were continued to be sent there as untreatable exiled patients right up through the middle of the 20th century, which I found interesting. There was, I think we found out, a cure. Obviously, there is now, as Hansen's disease is bacterial in nature. So now there are cures, as there are for many diseases that were considered incurable. And while patients and family members of patients are allowed to stay if they wish, there are no active patients or active cases that are currently at the Kalaupapa settlement. It's actually part of the National Park Service now. And with a reservation, you can go and visit and see everything that's there. What drove me to recommend the book to the book club was, quite honestly, I didn't want to read the book. I understood what happened in Moloka'i. I learned about Hawaiian history when I lived there, and I knew the pain. I knew the deep scar that both leprosy, Hansen's disease, and Moloka'i and Kalaupapa left on the people. And it was one of many scars that had been left on the Hawaiian culture over the centuries, candidly, since James Cook paddled his way onto the Big Island and caused the Hawaiians to understand that there were people outside of the islands themselves. I didn't want to read it, and because book club is all about expanding your horizons, I thought, well, maybe we should anyway. And I found, as I actually listened to the book, I didn't read it, as you know. I don't actually read a lot of the books. I listen to them because I can listen to many, many more books doing other things. The weight of what happened comes through so strongly in this book. And the history of Hawaii is told in such a unique narrative through the eyes of a small child as she grows up and in the perspective of her family, her wider family, that I was really happy that the rest of the book club kind of went along with me. I'll put it that way.
Well, I learned so much about Hawaiian history. I think I had known at least some of the political history, but I didn't have a full understanding of some of the effects of colonization, and especially colonization through the missionary movement. I certainly had no idea that Native Hawaiians were more vulnerable to, and of course it makes perfect sense, more vulnerable to Western diseases like Hansen's disease. I knew about the smallpox with the mainland indigenous population, but hadn't thought about what happened to a lot of the Pacific Islanders who may have experienced similar things. So the story deals with a double tragedy: the physical toll of the disease on a vulnerable population and the cultural toll of exile. How do you think the book challenges us to confront an uncomfortable part of American and Hawaiian history that some would rather leave unacknowledged?
It's such a brilliant question. And I think the author, who is neither female nor Hawaiian, approached this in such a profoundly human way through the eyes of a child. At the age that Rachel Kalama is introduced to us, she's 6 or 7 years old. She's known only her family. She's known only the beauty of the island around her. She's been cosseted by her larger ohana, her extended family, in love and caring. And so the brutal nature of her separation, even when tinged with the kindness of some who were involved in that extraction, really, from her home, is the beginning of the understanding of a wider implication. If it happened to a little child who is expressing their feelings in the way they're expressing them, imagine that by 100, 1,000, over and over again, not just once. You mentioned the Western diseases. It was sexually transmitted diseases. It was smallpox. It was measles. It was leprosy. It was everything, because you have to remember, Hawaii is the most isolated population center on the globe, 6,000 miles to the nearest landmass. And there's nothing north or south of it besides the poles. So it sits there in the middle of the ocean. And if you don't stumble on it by accident without knowing where it is, you're not going to find it. And that's how James Cook found it. He almost stumbled on it by accident, although I'm sure some people thought he navigated straight for it. The approach of the author, I think, gave us not just an innocence view of what was happening around them, but gave us the long arc of the transition of Hawaii in that historical context, from candidly a monarchy, through the overthrow of that monarchy, through the territorial nature of the transition to World War II, just a smidge before statehood. So it was a brilliant device for showing us an arc of Hawaiian history that touched all the major transitions.
Well, there are also many books about Father Damien, who founded Kalaupapa as a leper colony. He's very famous, but hardly anything about the human beings exiled there as patients and against their wills. Brennert doesn't shy away from showing how the Catholic Church's presence was often a, quote, help that hurts, unquote. In your view, does the book's portrayal of religious overreach make it more dangerous to certain readers or more necessary?
I want to answer this a little differently. If we pull the camera back a little bit and look at the wider history of Kalaupapa, as I mentioned, the monarchy mandated exile of leprosy patients before Damien even came to Hawaii. And so the exiling and the separation began before he got there. And what Brenner does not address is the brutality of the early decades in Kalawao and then Kalaupapa. It was where people were sent to die, hideous deaths with no support. And so, as humans, if they felt there was nothing to live for, then they just did not live in a way that we would think is healthy or happy. Or if you were a child and you landed in the early times, it would be cataclysmic for a child. By the time Damien comes, there is a small amount of support, very small, from the territorial government. The reason Damien goes, and I I learned this when I was living in Hawaii because he was canonized as a saint when I was living there. And there was a lot of history that came out when he was canonized about his time in Hawaii. He had been visiting, as had Catholic missionaries. They hadn't been living there. And he decided that he needed to live there. He needed to live there because he was a trained carpenter. There were no buildings, and he went there to build. He went there to make a humane and, I'll say, sanitized, but a clean place for people to live like humans in his worldview, as opposed to what he found when he got there. He was also, in our current parlance, a lobbyist for more support. He would tell people that had resources that they needed to help the patients. And he was not a polished orator. He was a carpenter from Belgium, and he used the words that he knew, and he worked hard with his hands. And then he went and lived with the patients. No one ever said Father Damien was a sweet, kind man, but he went there to help them build a life they could live like, I don't want to say like humans. Obviously, they were all humans, but in a way that was more associated to the way Western civilization considered patients should be supported, with a hospital, with a church. He built a graveyard. He built housing. He made sure that children were set apart from adults so that they would be educated and they wouldn't be traumatized in a way that they might if they landed on the shore and saw a late stage Hansen's disease patient. Because and you read it, Rachel's description can be horrifying to see what this disease did to people's bodies. And so, on the one hand, are all these things true about missionaries? Did they impose their moral ethos on people? Absolutely. And it wasn't just the Catholics. The Protestant missionaries were the first missionaries there. They were the whalers. They came over to, I'll use the word, exploit natural resources, and then they got involved with the monarchy. What we learned about the Catholic missionaries is that they came in behind the Protestant missionaries, and they were working in a society that had already begun to shift from the indigenous religious practices, I'll say, to a more Christian approach, whether that was Protestant or Catholic. And so I understand the author's approach to, first of all, keeping Damien to the side. This is not a book about Damien. This is a book about the patients told through one patient's story, which was a brilliant way to approach it because it really humanized everything. And because I can hold two thoughts in my head. And the effect of what Damien and the sisters like Marianne Cope brought was a structure for the patients to live their lives in a way that may not have been exactly what they wanted, but it was a way that gave them a choice to an extent. And I think we also have to remember today we live in a very loosely religious constrained, most of us do, I'll say. As we're transitioning from the 19th to the 20th century, some people still were living in a very structured religious world, whether that was Christian religion, Jewish religion, Islamic religion, or indigenous religions, right? There were still religious practices that determined what you did in a day and how you did it. And so were the Catholic strictures any worse than the Protestant strictures? Maybe, maybe not. Were all the Christian strictures more oppressive than the indigenous strictures? I don't know enough about the indigenous strictures. I suspect just the fact that they were different was difficult enough. If the author portrayed them in the way he felt necessary to tell his story, and that puts people off, I would say shame on the people it puts off, as opposed to shame on the author. Read through it. Get through it because this book is worth it.
Well, and thank you for giving us such a nuanced picture of Father Damien and even the nuns who were also there. Censorship often happens when people focus on the so-called graphic nature of a book's subject matter. Do you feel that by focusing on the medical or sexual content, some readers are missing the deeper story of Rachel's humanity and her right to a full life?
That one I will answer with a simple yes. I mean, isn't isn't Rachel allowed to be a full human being with every aspect of what that is? Don't we all come with a medical history, a sexual history, a psychological history, a family history? Why wouldn't Rachel be allowed to have that in her life? And why shouldn't the author describe it so that we can understand Rachel as a full human being?
I would say that the sexual content isn't that graphic. This isn't a bodice ripper type of novel. It's not a romance. There is a romance or some romances that happen, but it's not that explicit in nature. I think what may be more disturbing for people is the explicitness of this is what leprosy does to a human body. And thank goodness we cured it, or we know how to cure it. But I think it's important that we also know how bad it could actually be. And we don't want to go there again. The children born in Kalaupapa in the settlement were immediately taken from their parents to prevent them from contracting Hansen's disease because it was communicable. It still is a communicable disease. In the novel, Rachel experiences this twice. First as a child taken from her family, and later as a mother whose own child is taken away. How do you think this specific, quote, cycle of separation, unquote, changes our understanding of the settlement and its inhabitants?
The sense of loss is captured from the earliest pages of this book, and it reverberates throughout. As I shared earlier, I didn't open a physical book and read this book. I actually listened to it on audiobook. And there is an extremely poignant part early in the book when the Kalama family goes down to Honolulu Harbor to welcome her father home. And it is the same day that a boat leaves Honolulu for Kalaupapa with exiles on it. There is a Hawaiian chant that goes up, away, away. It is heart-rending to hear it spoken aloud with all of the loss behind it. I almost now, but then I sobbed hearing it in my head, knowing what it meant. These people were basically saying goodbye to their family as though they were burying them. That loss was not just felt by the people saying goodbye, but the people to whom they were saying goodbye. It was almost like they were burying their family on the other side. But the trial was yet to come for them because they had a physical issue they had to go through. The part of the book where Rachel gives birth and then has to give up her child is also heartbreaking. It is a very quiet scene because they have to do it in secret. Because if the authorities who ran the settlement knew that she had a child, they would have taken it immediately. They would have put her in a hospital. She would never have seen her child. And so, with the help of her extended ohana, she bears her child and has a moment with her child that informs the rest of her life. She can never not think about her child again. It actually has such a huge impact, not just on the end of the book, but on the sequel, as you know. I'm not going to give it away. People have to read it.
We like
But
that.
yeah, but one of the reasons I bring this up is the book is such an incredible, multifaceted look at not just Hawaiian history, but also about the resilience of humans as a human being. How do you survive a loss like being taken away from your family when you're 7 years old? How do you survive the loss of your uncle, your auntie, your friends? How do you keep going? There's a part of being human that just says, I have to keep going. It is the resiliency that the author brings through, not just for Rachel, but at the end of the book, we find out for her family as well. There's an inherent ability for the human spirit to keep on going, which I find amazing and which I was not expecting in this book.
I didn't expect it either. And you're right. It was amazing. And Despite being cast out, the residents of Kalaupapa, they built a thriving society. What can modern readers, especially those feeling isolated or marginalized today, learn from the way Rachel and her community redefined quote unquote family? If we remove books like Moloka'i from libraries, what does that say about how we treat stories of people who are marginalized or put away by society? Are we essentially exiling them a second time?
I think exiling a second time might be more than I would go. But having lived in a big city, having lived in a small city, having lived in the suburbs, I think one of the things I've learned is it is possible to be alone and not lonely, and it is possible to be lonely in a crowd. And if we don't reach out to people who are lonely, people who have effectively been segmented away from us, and people who need a hand, then does that make us good humans if we can find a way to give of ourselves again, right? I think, and astoundingly, I've read studies about this, that we are actually genetically encoded to be altruistic. It is in our best interest to help each other. And in the separating of humans from other humans, we're denying our own nature. And that is not healthy for any of us. So I think if someone is wondering, can I learn from this book? What can I do? Can this be a sort of template for helping to reach other people? I think the answer to that is yes. I would recommend that even in the darkest moments, that there's a bright light that we can offer someone else, even if it's just tiny. I don't know that everyone will always appreciate it, but it's worth the effort of trying, always.
Yeah, for what it does to us, not
Mhm.
just how it helps others. So Rachel's story is more than just a chronicle of exile. It's a testament to the idea that even when the world tries to hide a community away, their voices and their history remain undeniable. What is one final thought you want to leave with our listeners about Rachel's story or the importance of facing history, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable?
As humans, we only actually learn when we are uncomfortable. It is how our brain is wired. I urge everyone to be a little uncomfortable in order to learn and become a more resilient human being. Rachel didn't have a choice. She had to be uncomfortable. She was forcibly removed from her family, but she did have a choice about how she responded to it. And she responded with love and caring when she could give it back. And she responded by being willing to reach out to others and recognizing other people who had been separated as humans and treating them with humanity and respect. And I think if we can all get there, as uncomfortable as it may be, the world will just be a better place.
When I was working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I used to say frequently, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So, Rosemarie, thank you so much for all of your insights today and your thoughtfulness about this book, Moloka'i, and for choosing it in the first place, because I certainly learned a lot when we read it. Our next episode will be a discussion of Little Black Sambo by Helen Bannerman. That will be our first children's book on the podcast. Thank you all for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into